All right, we are back. It is Jack Murphy. This is the Jack Murphy Live podcast. We are going live today. You can find me, Jack Murphy, on Twitter at Jack Murphy Live, the website, jackmurphylive.com, on YouTube, Jack Murphy Live, Jack Murphy Live everywhere. The book is Democrat to Deplorable. Go out and get a copy right away. It's on Amazon. And of course, if you're interested in the liminal order, come down and check us out, liminal-order.com. My guest today is a very, very special person, a brilliant guy that I've had the pleasure of getting to know over the last couple of years. His name is Michael Guimarin. Michael, how are you, buddy?
Great, Jack. Just happy to be here.
Yeah, awesome. It's great to have you. We've been talking about doing this for a little bit. We got a lot of big subjects to get to and a lot of interesting, sort of mind-blowing things to consider. But first, before we get there, I want to introduce you a little bit to our audience. Sometimes I have very, very well-known guests on here. Sometimes I have people that not everybody knows, and I like it like that. So let's get into a little bit about you, Michael. Who are you, buddy? Where are you coming from? What are you doing right now? Why are we talking, Michael?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Jack. I'm going to try to focus more on sort of what I've experienced and what I've done as opposed to the credentials I have. But I have a very traditional academic background, going to top schools, this sort of thing. And basically, we're talking today about the information environment, sort of network warfare, sense making. And, for me, that story starts when I was 11 and then translates through getting a degree in cognitive psychology. So at 11, I started to learn how to program. I became sort of practitioner level, not particularly great at it. Decided that I wanted to study how people think instead. Had some pretty cool experiences there in the behavioral finance space. So that's what my undergraduate thesis was at Princeton. And then after that, I joined a search engine that no one's ever heard of, but it was a really formative experience for me. And we did things at web scale, and then continued to be a programmer in some really large technology infrastructure that billions of people use every month.
Yeah, it's important here to point out that Michael's been doing some interesting work behind the scenes. He's been doing work high levels in Silicon Valley, studying psychology, studying the way people think, studying the way people interact with networks, how computers shape the way that we work and interact with the world, and it's going to shape the way that everything happens in the future. And we can talk. Let's talk briefly about the notion of computeracy, like the same thing as literacy. Tell us a little bit about that, Michael, because that was one of the first things that you and I discussed.
Yeah. So about 10 years ago, I noticed that there was this very, very significant break for me in the way things were being organized as they were getting digitized. And a lot's been written about this topic, and I went on this quest to find if there were primitives. So most of our society is built on literacy and numeracy. And depending on the degree to which people have either of those two skills, you get different things that come out of it. And, arguably the Industrial Revolution started in 1430s with Gutenberg drastically reducing the cost of literacy through printing the Bibles. And as a result, there was a huge change in basically every facet of life, from religion to the way that the state was organized, et cetera, right? And I noticed in my work with computers that there was all this talk always about like, oh, you have to learn how to program. You have to learn how to program because the future is about computers. And I said, this is silly, right? Like learning how to program so that you understand computers is like saying, you need to learn how to write a Shakespearean sonnet in order to be able to read it. And so instead I said, okay, well, what are the actual things that we can do with computers as an appliance? Like how does the oven work as opposed to how do I build an oven? And what can I bake in it? And then from falling out of that, I created a model that then started to predict things that were happening, right? And a very obvious one for a lot of people is the first industry to be digitized was the music industry. And it went through a very specific set of checkpoints to be where it is today, right? And you could make a good argument that all of our other industries or organizations or institutions are going through this sort of same process.
Let's dig into that a little bit, right? So
Yeah.
we're talking about the digitization of music. First thing that comes to mind is Napster. Man, I'll never forget being a junior employee in an office with broadband internet in the late '90s. And when Napster hit, and boy, did we didn't do anything for like a month at work except for download music off of Napster, and it seemed like the craziest thing ever, and it was just mind blowing experience. Actually, really, if people live through it, they know what I'm talking about, because it did represent just a seismic shift in everything, and it was definitely a mile marker. So let's talk about what happened there, because I think it's really important to think about as we carry the same arc all the way through into politics, into tribalism, etc. It's all very similar.
Yeah. So 1994, the Mosaic browser comes out. I think it was 1994, which all of a sudden gives anyone the ability to send text to each other for, let's call it free, right? There's a setup cost and there's an operating cost, but the marginal cost is free.
Yeah.
With music, when you think about pre-Napster or pre-MIRC, if you were downloading from those things, or pre-Usenet, you had to actually go to a record store and buy a CD. And you didn't really get to choose which songs were on that CD. That was chosen by other people. And you didn't get to choose which records were available at the record store. There was a cost that you had for these CDs, and they basically raised the price until everyone was able to buy, let's say, 1 or 2 CDs every period, right? So they might buy 1 CD a month. And then what happened with Napster is the cost of distribution for that individual song went from something to nothing overnight, right? And you had all this pent up demand for music because people were like, okay, this month I'm going to buy the Offspring CD. Next month I'm going to buy Smashing Pumpkins, et cetera, et cetera. And then all of a sudden it was like, holy shit, I can download a ton of music for free. And like you said, everyone just stopped, right? Just stopped everything and downloaded as much music as they could. They didn't have a place to store it. And there's an interesting discussion about how Apple capitalized on that and made the iPod. Yep. But they just went crazy, right? And there was a period where, and I remember this, it's like, I don't remember the exact specifics, but for me, it's so emblematic of what we're going through right now, which is this entity, the Recording Industry of America, or Association of America, the RIAA. Suddenly they became this thing in pop culture. And there was this story of a grandmother who was being fined or sued for $800,000 because her grandson torrented 11 songs, some of which were Metallica songs, right? And just the level of insanity that you would have a huge multi-billion-dollar corporation or conglomerate suing like an 80-year-old woman for something that their grandkid did. It's like, and it's a tempest in a teacup, right? And when it was contained to music, it was fine. I mean, unless you were in the music industry. And then of course there's a story there that it's bigger than ever. But now just imagine that same process happening for media and politics and, the government services themselves.
Right. Everything that used to aggregate and then distribute information is being totally disrupted.
Yeah.
We can transmit information in a million different ways, from many to many instead of from one source to many.
Yeah.
We can produce information, receive information, distribute information. And so if you take away all of the costs involved in basically distributing or receiving, obtaining information, I mean, what happens to the value of information at that point?
Yeah, it's really good, right? So when we think about value, we tend to think of things that are scarce or difficult to obtain are valuable, right? And if you think about this as like, okay, I want to learn something very specific. It's in a specific book. I go to my library. I don't find it, so I have to go to a bigger library, et cetera, et cetera. And so the amount of effort that you have to put in to get that information increases pretty dramatically. And so the value of that information to you once you have it needs to be high. Well, when you remove those barriers to value, right? When you make it abundant, right? And it's not even that and this is sort of where a lot of Gen Xers get confused, right? Because they have all this ideas about the S curve, right? Not you, Jack, obviously, but all these singularitarians who talk about like the end times because they can't see beyond this S curve of exponentiation and the reduction in the cost, right? Because every time you reduce the cost in something, consumption goes up. And so it looks like you're going to have infinite consumption, but once you hit zero, that doesn't actually happen. Anyway, so what happens is you make something abundant, right? And a good heuristic for people is it costs approximately 1 penny to send a 20-minute high definition video to you, right? And that's about a gigabyte of information. And you can basically transmit all of Wikipedia for a few pennies, right? And so functionally, information is free. And when something is no longer scarce, it's no longer valuable, which is very difficult for us and undermines our entire sense-making environment, because when we're small children, all the way up through today, we have this constant reinforcement that learning something new, like getting some insight, is valuable, right? And a lot of our credentialism, whether it's an MBA or a law degree or a doctorate, and any of these things are predicated on this idea that we're going to train you for some period of time in all of this really esoteric knowledge, because you may not have access to it ever again, and you need to be a certain way. And that paradigm is totally broken.
So those were artificial barriers to distribution, artificial barriers in terms of licensing and things like that on one hand, artificial in terms of having monopoly control on the information. And then we were also trained to believe that things that if things cost more, they were worth more in some respects, right?
Yeah.
But now we've got, not only has information been liberated, and not only has the distribution of information been reduced to practically nothing, but now there's also an infinite amount of sources of information as well too. So even without the infinite sources, the value of information, the distribution cost of information have been diminished so much that it's basically free. So now you've also just throw in the fact that there's just now an infinite amount of new information and information sources. And all of a sudden we're just overwhelmed with information, right? We're awash with information, some good, some bad, some deliberately good, some deliberately bad, some accidentally bad. Either way, the information space, the zone, is completely flooded. And so if information becomes less valuable now, what is more valuable? What has had its value increase in this environment?
Yeah, that's a complicated question, right? The short answer is curators or resonators, but I think it might be helpful for your listeners to talk a little bit about fake news and why that happens through the lens of information being free. Is that something that we can talk about?
Yeah, 100%. But let's make sure we get back to the curation thing.
Sure. Yeah. So human stories, everything is a story that we tell ourselves. The stories have sort of contradictory facts, and a good journalist or a good storyteller reduces the amount of information and generalizes it so that it's broadly applicable, right? And there's something very well-known effect called the Gell-Mann amnesia effect, which is basically you read an article in the newspaper on a topic that you're very familiar with, perhaps a baseball game that you were at the day before, and the author has reduced the signal so that it's easier for people to interpret what happened to such an extent that they've messed up cause and effect. And you look at it and you're like, this is stupid. Like, I was there at this game. This wasn't true. And then you turn the page and then you read something else and you're like, huh, this is interesting. You don't realize that the information that you're reading in that something else is just as problematic. So when information has a cost to distribute, like I need printing presses, I need delivery boys, I need journalists and all these places in the world, there's a natural emergence of basically supply side economics, where there's an economic incentive to delivering information in an as efficient way as possible. And then, of course, we build up these entire systems of control, right? So, on the quality side, you have the Pulitzer Prize. On the non-quality side, you have the government instituting regulations around free speech, right? And what happened on the internet is that the New York Times, right? Let's use an example. Let's say it costs $10 a month to subscribe to the New York Times. So I'm subscribing to the New York Times. Now, all of a sudden, everybody has internet browsers, and some guy named Bob gets his newspaper at 6 a.m. in the morning, and he just types in all of the articles in the New York Times into Bob's news website, right? He pays $10 a month. He puts them on there, right? Now, all of a sudden, at the margin of people who are looking for news, right? So not already subscribers to the New York Times, but just at the margin, someone might say, hey, wait a minute, here's an article about an event that happened, and the facts are the same between Bob's website and the New York Times, not knowing that Bob just straight up copied the New York Times, right? And so if I'm the New York Times, I'm going to start to lose subscribers at the frontier of my business to this problem, right? And Bob is just like, hey, there were 100 facts in that original story. The New York Times is reporting 30 of them. I'm reporting 30 of them with the narrative. And now all of a sudden he wants to monetize, right? So he can set up a subscription for $9 a month, right? And you can see how there's a race to the bottom. And eventually what happened was new business models around advertising happened where you would have like a display ad, right? And so the idea then was not actually to get people to read the articles, but to just open them. And when that happened, there was a sensationalization, obviously, in the article titles, because as people are reading snippets, are they deciding to read the story from the New York Times, or are they deciding it to read from Bob? And by the way, there's like 100,000 Bobs. And then, like, what happened was people realized that there was no differentiation in all this objective news. And I want to say that Andrew Breitbart was the first guy to really capitalize on this with Breitbart. And so he shifted from, okay, we're going to have a news organization that's about objective news, right? And because of supply side economies of scale, you can't compete with the New York Times before the internet because they're already there and people are already subscribed. They're already the biggest. But as soon as you can distribute for free, anyone can compete with the New York Times. And so you get the situation with the 100,000 Bobs, and then you get Andrew Breitbart saying, okay, we're going to shift from objective news to perspective-based news, right? And that story that you had with 100 facts, some of which contradicted themselves, that you then supplant down to 30 facts, well, it gets a little bit different, because now you may not choose the same 30 facts that the New York Times did. You may choose a different set of 30 facts that tell a perspective-based story. And the game theory for this is that all these other news organizations start understanding it. Wait a minute, Breitbart's getting a lot of clicks. They're making a lot of money by having this perspective-based news. And they all start doing that, right? And then, of course, there's value to saying, well, I use these 30 facts and he uses those 30 facts. And there's only an overlap of 10 facts. So he's wrong because 20 of my facts dispute the other 20 that he said. And normal people don't have the ability to like understand the nuance. And then layered into that is that there aren't 100 facts anymore. There are 1,000 facts, right? Because you can just make up things at the point of distribution, right? So you like literally Bob could be writing his article, 9 facts are true, and then 11 facts are false. And so then, and who's to say what's true and what's false? Because not everybody actually has access to the underlying source event.
There's some really incredible dynamics at work here when we start talking about curation rather than straight news delivery, right? So you're creating perspectives, and what are perspectives? Perspectives are stories. And now we're like in the normal sense, stories. And now we're distributing those stories all around the internet. And really what's happening is it's competition for narrative and narrative positioning in your mind. And so the facts become less valuable. The curation becomes more valuable. The stories then become even more valuable. And then the stories that you can tell that relate to the most people or can form a dedicated tribe or following around these stories sort of become the product of this like curation system that we're in. And I'm wondering if you could explain just a little bit more about like, how do you see the value of the curator in this infinite sea of information where we're all still, this is still just the very, very beginning of this new environment that we live in. So nothing that's happened is really predictive of the future. And we just don't know where all this is going to go. Right. So where are we right now in terms of like having to deal with an infinite amount of data pieces, and knowing as animals that our tribes form around shared imagined orders, these stories that we tell ourselves in our head. And then we know that this guy over here tells himself the same story in his head. So therefore we're now buddies. So let's make that link between the data, the curation, and like tribe formation.
Sure. So there's infinite information, like you said, and we can't process infinite information, and not everyone has the time to go down all these rabbit holes constantly, although we love doing it, right? Well, suddenly it'll be like, oh, that was 2 hours on Wikipedia. And so what naturally happens is that people who have an economic interest at being at that choke point logistically they actually start shaping narratives and trying to make sense of the information, curating what you should and shouldn't read, and the degree to which it's helpful or resonant to the people that follow them. And when I say resonant, I mean, how much does it align with the particular set of beliefs, insights, and cognitive biases of the readers? Then they become more and more powerful, right? And we're at early stages because everyone still looks at, right? So instead of the New York Times, which is like, how do you, who is that, right? It's not a person. I can't actually be upset with them. So everyone's shifting to individuals like yourself. There's a lot of folks on our side of the internet. You might say like Scott Adams or Mike Cernovich or Jack Posobiec, who are all examples of curators that have emerged. That's sort of an intermediate step. The next step is actually looking at us not so much as like as linearly connected like you would in a large organization, but as more like a fabric. And that's a very interesting conversation when you talk about network formation and graph theory and all that kind of thing. And that's sort of where it's going to go. So basically, everyone's going to become a curator. And when we talk about adjacency and we talk about distance to other, let's call them nodes, right? Like how long or how strong is the edge? When you form a fabric, right, you get like, if you think about telephone, right, it's a linear process of telling someone a piece of information. Now, if you think about where we're going and where we are, it's more a question of like, I look a lot more like a neuron, and I have the ability to set up a synapse with anyone on the internet that I want. And there's only so many synapses that I can like do in my head, right? You would think it'd be about 150, but I see people getting away with having like 300, 500 Twitter connections before their brain starts to kind of melt and they can't keep track of it. And so you want to be like very discriminatory in who you choose. And then, just like a spider that's sitting at the center of the web with all of these strands that go out in different directions, you're basically doing that with all these different curators. And so as information transmits mimetically across the fabric, which you might think of as like Twitter or the social networks, it'll tug and pull on different strings. And so you'll get a sense. And if you curate your own network really well as a consumer, then you'll be able to get really high quality information very quickly from the network.
Right.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of ideas there, but sort of hopefully
curation is not only essential to the larger macro issue, but you brought up a good point. It's essential to your individual station as well. I always recommend people on Twitter, follow people for whatever reason, follow them to be nice, follow them so you can DM them, follow them to say thank you. But really the heart of Twitter is in the lists, and create a list with 25 or 50 people of your top follows on that. Check that list first every day. Curate your information intake. It's important. It's like a life skill that people are going to need to develop, because it's like without teaching people how to curate, it's like we're just throwing them in the ocean and then they just sink and they just drown and they're overwhelmed.
Yeah. I think it's actually more like we're throwing them into the mall food court, right? So if you look at a person's nutrition, and we'll use nutrition as a metaphor because I think we're all understanding with it. If you see someone who's unhealthy and then you ask them, hey, what are you eating? And they're like, oh, I eat a dozen donuts every single day. You're like, okay, you're obese because you eat a dozen donuts. That's a bad nutrition that you got. Your diet is not very good, right? And the same is true with information. And of course, I'm not the first one to say this. You're not the first one to say this. Everyone's saying this. If you're following 5,000 people and you don't really have control over the information diet that you have, like what's the equivalent of obesity, right? Is it Trump derangement syndrome? Is it, these beliefs and these endless conspiracy theories, trust the plan if we want to say on the other side. Yeah. Right. And so, and unfortunately, because our persuasive technology is so powerful and we understand dopamine loops and persuasion and this kind of thing, you can actually be entrained, right? Which is a concept that comes out of music. That's when everyone's clapping at the same time. And through the dopamine hit of a particular information source, right, by curating someone's information environment, you can basically like program them to believe anything you want, right? And Facebook did this in 2011, 2012, and it's totally not allowed in psychology, but They basically made people happier or sad, and then realized they could move someone from like a conservative position to a liberal and vice versa and all this kind of thing. And that was all through curating their information. And same with Google, right? PWS equals 0, personalized web search, used to be a URL parameter that you could throw in, and it would totally change your search results, because they were building a profile for you and changing the actual results that you were getting based on what they believed you were most likely to click. So there's an economic incentive for them to show you things that already resonated. To my earlier point about curators are going to be people who resonate with you, but they realized that this system that was creating these personalized web searches could actually be manipulated. And now, of course, they don't really do URL parameters like PWS anymore. And I don't think that particular example worked, but there are other systems that are like that, right? And we know if I only give people the New York Times, or they only watch CNN, or they only get their news from the Daily Show, or they only follow Alex Jones, they're going to have a completely different reality than other people.
This is a great example of how you think you might be curating your own information diet by going to Google, it's doing specific searches and doing your own research, but you're only getting shown the options that they want you to see. And that problem has never been more troublesome than it is today. We certainly know that that's the case. We know that they will pre-populate your search query with suggestions that they want you to think about, and it changes for different people, and it changes from time to time. We've seen evidence of that. And so even if you think you're being deliberate about your information sources and your research and investigation, you're still being stymied by Google. You're still being stymied by search. You're still being manipulated by Facebook, and even more so now on Twitter. You're being manipulated, even though you think you're being very proactive about who you follow and what you pay attention to. It's still not just the raw data feed, and you're still not just having pure access to the information that you want so that you can curate it personally. And so there does become some now value layer added in for an actual real life human curator, right? Someone who you can trust. And when they do give you information that feels right to you, or it seems right, or it jives with your biases, I mean, are you really learning anything, or are you really just confirming what you think you already knew?
It's a little both.
Yeah. It's a little bit of both.
Yeah. I mean, like, I also have a degree in classics, a small one, but basically the stories that we tell are the same stories. They're not new. So there's nothing at all that's happening that's unique, right? It's just like, you can read all of history. And so question is like, where do you fit in the cycle of civilization, right? Like, where is right now? And there's, a lot of discussion on that. And I think that's great to talk about, and insofar as it's actually helpful for you. And then try to understand, like, am I the hero of my own story? And what archetypes are out there, and what archetypes we've seen in history. And, to your point, am I consuming information that is, purely confirmation bias? Is that necessarily a bad thing if I'm achieving the life goals that I've set? Right. We're all going to have a very difficult conversation, which is, in the past, because there were so few news sources, right? Like, if you think about your great grandparents and how many people they were likely to encounter, or news sources they were likely to encounter in a week, it's like maybe 1 or 2 that were new. Today, it could be hundreds, right? Just scrolling through Twitter for 5 minutes, it could be 50 people. And so and of course, with our great grandparents, and it's all the way back to the beginning of civilization, 400 generations ago, right? So we have all of this social structure around, oh my God, this person that seems like really powerful is scarce. So I really need to listen very clearly what they're saying at church. And all of that comes to us now, and we're just to like a random person on the internet, right? And we're all, of course, very skeptical of this. But those of us who were born before 1994, and it's really like, if we were not 12 by 1994, we have a much bigger problem than the kids, right? The kids grew up in this environment, so they understand, like, oh, Susie said you're a bitch. It's like, oh yeah, well, Susie, C word, right? So like, they don't have a problem. Gen Z, they're totally fine. They understand exactly how to operate in this information environment. It's just like, like people like me, millennials, people like you who are, and the boomers are just kind of like out to pasture, so it doesn't really matter. But like,
yeah, but
we're the ones that are screwed. That's true.
But they vote, and they vote in big numbers, and and people are manipulated by information all the time. And so curation for your personal self is very important. Curation as an economic force is very important. Curation in the information space is very important. And one of the reasons why is because we get manipulated, and John Robb talks about this a lot, through empathetic triggers, where we don't even have an option to put critical thinking to it. This empathy is pre-language. It's inside us. It's inside animals. And I mean, even I've read chickens have empathy. And so if you can trigger an empathetic reaction in someone through the use of information, you kind of control them without people even knowing it. And so it's very, very important to begin to build a skill set and a perspective and a worldview and like a holistic approach to how to be a human being in this information space that we live in. There's no doubt that we live in a polluted information space. There's no doubt that we live in an information war. There's no doubt people are competing for control of your brain through narrative warfare and through images and memes and ideas, and just trying to get you to sort around certain ideas. And so to the extent that an individual wants to be sovereign, let's say, personal sovereignty, which is a key core value of the liminal order. And we study this extensively, and it's one reason why we're talking about it today. If you want to create a human being that can be successful and thrive in this novel environment, it's brand new. We are not physically evolved to deal with the information that we are given on a daily basis. Our society hasn't evolved with norms, customs, laws, anything, and how to deal with this new environment. Our parents don't know what to teach our children about how to grow up in this environment. You know, you teach your kid to tie your shoe, that's great, but now we need to teach them also, how do you manage information? How do you become a person who has ideas rather than a person who is had by an idea? You know, Jordan Peterson has said this famously, and maybe he got it from somewhere else, I don't know, but he said that people don't have ideas. Ideas have people. That sounds like a pretty bad place to be. I don't want to be had by an idea. I want to have my own ideas, and I want to have the strength and the fortitude in order to understand them and then express them and then embody them in my life today. So this is our transition point here into like sense making and sovereignty. And what do we do, Michael? Let's start from the beginning, because this is something new and we need to figure it out quickly.
Yeah. So I think the first thing that I would say is, you know, whenever you have a problem, being able to define what the problem is, you know, more than half the battle. So I think accepting to ourselves that the information environment that we're in is different from the information environment in which we grew up in, and in which all of our social mores and customs, like you said, all of our laws are designed to help us with, right? Like the topic of sense making, which is really, you know, starting to emerge, and there's a bunch of definitions, but mine is an intentional process for understanding, right? So the topic of sense making is this emerging is like, okay, we want to have an intentional process. Why do we have an intentional process, right? Like most people make sense of the world without an intentional process because it's so fundamental, the rules, if you will. But now that our information environment has changed, the rules that we have to live by also change, right? So that's the first thing, is that you have to say like, okay, this is new. Most people have no idea how to deal with this because most people are consumers, right? And that gets us into the second thing, is that you have to accept fundamentally that 1% of society are creators, 9% are contributors, and 90% are consumers. So as soon as you make that choice, I'm going to figure out how to live intentionally, you've immediately wiped out 90% of people being able to help you, which means that most of the stories that you read about in the newspaper or whatever are not going to be helpful, right? All the self-help, all that kind of thing. It's like you're basically going out on your own. And we're in a new situation. And so the number of people that are talking about sense making, or let's be intentional about our process, is vanishingly small, maybe like 10 that I can think about. And that's, you know, that gets us to why we're talking today, which is, you know, that I've started to coach people on sense making, and that this idea of, okay, how can we expand our personal sovereignty so that we can make better decisions that's come to the forefront.
Right. And making sense of the world as a factor in your personal sovereignty is something that's very important to me. It's one of the core values of the liminal order. And in fact, we started some of these discussions inside the liminal order. Michael is a proud member, a founding member of the liminal order as well. And we began these discussions, 18 months ago inside the liminal order. And we started off with just some basic sense making seminars, right? We started off with doing just like talking about it and basically, starting to get a general sense of what things are. Mike, I think you're muted right now. Just after
I turned it off because the gardeners are here, of course.
Oh, okay, got it. Okay, and so I want to sort of go through the process that we've done inside the LO in terms of identifying sense making, developing it, understanding the concepts. And I'm also going to tie that into like how things inside the LO work too. So let's just start down the road of sense making, how you came to be interested in it, what you've done, what the groundwork is, and let's start to just build the case and talk about all the tools and the necessary components.
Yeah, so I would say the reason why I became interested in the topic was I was originally interested in, and let me know if this gets to be too much and I'll try to wave them off. But
hey, we got no choice, man. Keeping it alive and raw. Here we go.
Basically, in my work with really big computer systems and information, right, I had like a lot of free time to program in these systems, and there aren't a lot of people that do that. I realized that we needed to come up with some ways to understand these information ecologies that helped us. Right. And so I personally thought Computeracy was going to be the interesting thing that people were interested in. And it turned out that was like a really esoteric topic and most people weren't interested in that conversation. But when coronavirus hit, the ability to, use the network that I had built and that we had built in the liminal order to get very quick on, okay, what's our OODA loop for this thing? And, what are some tangible actions that we can take as a result of the information that's coming at us in the ecology? And how do we basically collapse the wave function of what's happening like really quickly and very efficiently, right? And so it was like a great example of this entire concept of thinking at a network level rather than thinking at an individual level, and how much faster we were doing it that way, right? Like there were these small communities on Twitter. And for me, the people that stand out are, Balaji in tech, Adam Townsend, Huntsman, Cernovich, Pasovic, and like one other person who I'm forgetting right now. They were on this thing from day one. And then there were a bunch of like anonymous alts that are always spitting crazy conspiracy stuff. But basically by knowing those 8 people, you had 100% what we were going to do in like January. Right. And so from that, we were able to extrapolate, okay, like what are these people saying? They've been right, which is why we use them as curators, right? Because that's really important for a curator. Not so much that not when I say right, I don't mean they're always predicting things correctly. What I'm saying is that their curation is consistent through time so that you understand that they have a particular perspective and they're going to be consistent about that perspective. And insofar as they are, then that allows you to relate yourself to other people, right? And so this concept of relating ourselves in the information space to other entities that are consistent through time, that are efficient, that allows people to start to build up a new model for how to consume, right? And so we basically took all the things that came about of us trying to figure out what's going on with sense making and then formalize them in a way that we could teach it, right? Where it's action first, example second, theory third, right? Like this topic is very deep, right? And there's a number of people on the internet who are way smarter than I am, who are at the frontier of this. People like, Schmachtenberger and, John Robb and Jordan Hall. You've all interviewed them on your podcast.
Indeed.
Right?
We've been on this for a while.
They tend to start with theory, which can be difficult for us little guys at the bottom, right? Where it's like, okay, great. Like I don't have a lifetime to like learn 4th generation warfare. What practically can I do tomorrow to fix my information environment, right? And so that was sort of where we started, was what are the simple things that I can do? What are some rules and heuristics that I can start to develop? And what's some experience that I can have to get better? Because if you don't, you go psychotic, right? Like if you're a media personality on Twitter and you're just consuming all these, you look at some of these people and they very clearly are going crazy, right? On the left and on the right. And they don't know what to believe anymore. And even people who are very like level-headed, right? So like famous lawyers or famous pundits or all these kind of things, they get consumed by these mimetic stories that just take them off, and you're like, what is going on, right? And so you see the value of it right here, right now.
Right. Indeed. I think it's good to point out in the liminal order, we were way ahead of the game on Corona, and that was because of our extensive intelligence network. You mentioned a number of guys earlier. A lot of them are involved either, tangentially or in the greater liminal order family. And we were able to just source information from all over the world, process it, put it together in a way that our members benefited directly. We had a position paper out written by you on coronavirus. I think we started pushing it out informally in January, but then formally in February. And that was a full month or 6 weeks before that weird day where the NBA game shut down and like the whole world. That's when everybody began to take it, holy crap.
Yeah.
When they walked off the court, in the game, and they're like, wow, this is serious. This is really happening. We knew that this was going to happen, weeks in advance. And all of our guys they had their vitamin D, their vitamin C. Some of them had HCQ. They had moved money out of the markets. They were prepared. We were prepared. And we were prepared because the LO is a sense-making apparatus.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't have as much of a formal structure or a formal notion of what that was prior to Corona. It was sort of like a sense that we had an idea that it was possible. But then when Corona happened, it was very clear that we were able to source, curate, synthesize, and put into practice, and apply information in a way much more quickly than other people and other groups out there. And what did it do? It possibly saved lives for sure, and it definitely made people save money. So there's real tangible value here for what we're doing. And so, as Michael said, we sort of saw the outcome of what happened inside, and we decided then, Michael did in particular, to try to deconstruct it and sort of figure out how are we going to formalize this process and how are we going to get better at it. And so Michael then began doing seminars for us on sense making, and then he's developed it into a course that several of us inside the liminal order took a couple of rounds with. So why don't you tell us like what that looks like, Michael, and explain how you broke it down and what you saw and how we're now teaching it to people and how you're also teaching it to people out there in the world at large.
Yeah, I think it really comes back to my experience the whole life and trying to explain what's happening to folks. This is a very difficult. Oh, did I lose Jack?
No, I'm right here, buddy.
Okay,
you just keep going. You're soloed.
I was going to say this is a very sort of difficult concept, right? Which is like, how do you tell someone that everything they understand about the world is fundamentally changed and they need to sort of reapproach it? And a lot of people, our education system, it tends to be very, one to many. So there's a teacher and then there's pupils, and it's very theory based. And I don't think this is super helpful for learning. I much more prefer the sort of the woodshop model, and maybe that's because I'm a guy. But I want to be in there like cutting the pieces of wood and making mistakes and learning how to use the saw and all the different tools. So that I can get better, right? And so when I was thinking about, how do I take a lifetime of experience dealing with information systems that can span billions of people, billions of documents, and then communicate it to somebody who, is a lawyer or a doctor or gardener, right? Or a student, all people that have taken the class. It starts with, okay, what are the actions that we want people to start doing so they can reinforce the concepts and that will show them immediately value without getting into explaining all of this crazy stuff that involves, shifting from supply side to demand side economics and, everything about the information environment. Like, we don't want to have to create like an entire world and then move somebody there. We want to give them some specific actions that they can take that will yield immediate results. And then like, oh, wow, I'm like not going crazy now. And then they want to take more. And then they ask, well, why is this working? Right. And then you can give examples. And then they want to learn more, and then you can finally give theory. So that was really the organizing principle of all this, which is there are a lot of really smart people, many of whom you've interviewed, who are pushing the frontier of the theory. That's great. How can we help folks who don't have 100 hours to learn the theory, right? Like, because like the way that they're teaching it is basically like, it's the same thing. It's like, all right, in order to be good at computers, you need to like become Mark Zuckerberg, right? That's like literally, it's like literally how people are saying for sense making, right? It's like, okay, you have to like learn all these crazy topics, which basically cover all of our knowledge, right? Like the people who are actually at the frontier are like ridiculously smart. And most people are like, I don't have time for that. I'm a lawyer, right? Like I got other things to do.
Rationally so. And I just want to interject that we've mentioned a couple of times normal people or regular people or whatever. And what we mean by that are people who are acting rationally in a way that suits what they need. So like, we're not talking about people that are being lazy or dumb or whatever. We're talking about people who are acting rationally because it just doesn't make any sense rationally for them to put in the time and the effort on this exactly, or in a number of other areas. So just one little.
Sorry, I'm talking about 10% of people who are willing to better themselves, right? Like 90% of people are just going to consume whatever they're given and just believe whatever they're given. And there's really no hope for them. And so like, and I don't mean that in like a cruel way. It's just that until a small percentage of people sort of show the way and show that it's possible, right? As we move through Moore's innovation curve, we're very much at the beginning of this wave. And it has to go through a bunch of different people before, like, no one's going to be like, okay, the information environment's changed. We need to go fix public education. Right. But anybody who talks to you can tell you that our education model makes zero sense in the environment that we have today. Right. Like it makes no sense. I mean, like if you actually want to educate people, right, there's a bunch of reasons why you might use it as a daycare center or indoctrinating centers or whatever. But if you like actually want to educate people on things that are helpful to not be automated, to not be obsoleted by computers or whatever, it's just like the worst way to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. And you know better than me. So
right, exactly. So how do we get people from being had by ideas to having their own ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I personally think it's a decision they have to make, which they have to go like, okay, like this is screwed up. I'm not alone. There's a lot of other people who recognize this is screwed up. What are some actions that I can start taking immediately to get better, right? And the first one is, every single person that you disagree with on Twitter, you need to unfollow them right now. Right. And you might be saying, oh, well, I need to have multiple perspectives. Absolutely not. Right. Like, so one of the principles that comes out from this idea that information is no longer scarce is the more valuable a piece of information is, like perceived to be, the freer it actually is. Right. And the best example of this, or the first example, was when Michael Jackson died. I didn't need to be a subscriber of Variety or one of these kind of magazines in order to find out about his obituary, right? Like everybody heard on Twitter that Michael Jackson died immediately, which means basically that the more important a piece of information is in terms of your life, the easier it's going to be for you to come across that piece of information, right? And so this idea that I need to have a balanced perspective by reading people I disagree with, totally false. All you're doing is you're confusing your brain and you're reinforcing loops and patterns that are not helping you, right? And you might, and unless you're like actually trying to become a curating node, then maybe there's an argument there. But for most people, like find someone who's giving you advice on Twitter or wherever social network you are, and that advice is actually helpful in the actions that you're taking in your everyday life, right? And then just stick with that person, amplify them. It's going to change your life, right? And then there's a whole bunch of other things that you could maybe pull over from nutrition, like fasting or whatever, and just apply them to the information diet, and that will immediately have benefits for you.
One of the fundamental elements of personal sovereignty that was discussed by Jordan Hall on podcast Jack Murphy Live number 10, I believe, which did form some of the foundational thinking for the liminal order, those conversations I had with Jordan and John Robb back in, I guess, the beginning of 2019, JML like 10, 11, 12, somewhere in there. Essential listening if you're interested in any of this stuff, guys. Go back and listen to that. In fact, that Jordan Hall podcast was the first thing I gave Michael to listen to all that time ago. And, it formed the foundation of what we're doing here. And then we've been trying to take exactly what you said, take their theories and other people's theories and turn it into actionable, practical stuff. And so one of the first levels of personal sovereignty is integrity, right? It's like your physical mental, emotional, spiritual integrity, and whether or not all four of those elements are integrated into a functioning whole that serves you. And so, talk about how if your integrity is challenged in any number of these ways, and we're not talking about like, did you do the right thing morally integrity? We're talking about physical, mental, emotional, spiritual integrity and the integration of all of those into a functional whole. Talk about how, if any of those are disrupted, you become what? Less of a sense maker, more susceptible to misinformation, disinformation? Is there a connection between your physical state and your acceptance of ideas into your brain and adoption of those narratives?
Well, so you already know that I believe and you believe that there is, right?
Yes.
Like that basically it's hard to explain, and maybe there's some better research than this, but my observation is that people who have their shit together in one area of their life, it tends to be contagious, right? And so when we're looking at, blue church, blue pill, whatever, betas, however you want to call it, and you're trying to get them to unplug, like the first thing that you talk about is like, okay, you need to go start like picking up heavy shit, right? And just do that. And then you get this confidence that's like, oh my God, I can pick up heavy shit, and then I can pick up heavier shit. And then all of a sudden you start this this cycle of self-improvement that starts going everywhere. Right. And maybe for you, it doesn't come with picking up heavy shit, but it comes with, I want to be healthier, right? Or I want to sleep better, or I want to be a better sense maker. And then you realize that, everything that is in our lives is integrated. It's a complex system. We are ourselves complex systems, and you can't just focus on one area to the exclusion of others. And then people start pointing out things that I think are humorous to me, which is you wouldn't go to a dentist with fucked up teeth, right? Like it's just like so incongruous. And so when you look at people who represent institutions, like specifically health institutions, and they are unhealthy looking, you're like, what the hell? Yeah. Like if you want to get jacked, you go to a 24, whatever the Gold's Gym is, and you look for the biggest dude there and you ask him, what did you do? Right? Like that's what you do. Like that's, and that guy is usually like pretty chill guy. And he'll like tell you to do these lifts, and this is how you start. And then you basically take action, right? And 90 out of 100 people don't. But like that's how you do everything, right? You just look for someone who already has done what you want to do, and then copy whatever it was that was working. And it's the same in sense making, right? It's like a lot of the curators that I mentioned earlier are super sane, level-headed people that are not going crazy, right? They've actually internalized their own mission to such an extent. They understand their position in the information ecology, right? Like, and as Jack mentioned, it's a total war out there, which a lot of us aren't used to, right? The idea of a total war and being a part of it in the West, people have no idea, right? They have no idea. Like the last time the US was in a total war was in the end of the Civil War with Sherman's March to the Sea, right? But like if you've ever, I can't even describe, like if you go to a place that has actual anarchy, right? So Democratic Republic of the Congo, Mogadishu, like there's certain areas of Western Sahara, like all these different places, those are like where total kinetic wars happen. We are experiencing something similar to that in the information ecology. When Donald Trump tweets, he may be having a conversation with one person that millions of people are party to, right? And they don't have the ability to act on that information. And so then they go crazy, right? And so what I'd want to say to people who are also thinking about this from a sense-making perspective is when you're interpreting information and trying to determine whether or not it's true, ask yourself before going through the cost of figuring out, like, is this true? The question, which is, depending on where this ends up, would I actually change an action that I'm already taking? And if the answer is no, then you shouldn't spend any time trying to understand whether or not it's true. And that's going to be a difficult practice to put in, but it will save you a tremendous amount of effort and heartache and manipulation.
Yeah, there's mindfulness comes to mind.
Yeah.
There has always been a need for mindfulness. Mindfulness has always been a positive thing. It does appear, though, that mindfulness in this environment is even more valuable than ever because we need that space inside, that time space between thought and action. in order to control yourselves, control your reactions, control what you're going to do next, and to control what you're distributing and how you're going to allow it to affect you or not. And this mindfulness is key. It's almost a superpower. You know, I've heard people say also that like being able to do deep work is a superpower now, and some other things which may not have always been in vogue. But mindfulness today, which starts with your mental, spiritual, physical, emotional health, and if it's all integrated, you can reach a high level of mindfulness. And I think it's just important for us to realize that when we're talking about empathetic triggers to mimetic action done by meme curators whose intention, whether they know it or not, I guess, can you not know your intention?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Because remember, it's a fabric, so it can roll through the fabric, and there could be a lot. Every single adjacency that you have could have no idea why they're spreading a meme. It's just that they've been trained to spread that kind of meme, or it resonates with them because they've been trained for it to resonate.
Right.
And now all of a sudden you're exposed to it 15 different times, and they're like, oh, this is something I should spread because everyone in my group is spreading it.
So either the people don't know it, if they don't know what their intentions are or not. The idea is to sort us and to create groups. And I mean, what is it on Twitter? It's to create a following and to have people in the audience. And so you're trying to sort the people out who don't want to be in and the people who should be in. And when we can be more susceptible to that type of manipulation depending on our physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health, and whether or not these things are integrated. And so the work that we do in the liminal order starts always with physical fitness. We have physical standards. Every new guy that comes in gets pointed right to the standards. If they can't meet them, they have to be working towards them. If you don't want to work towards them, you can't be in the liminal order. And it's not because we're a bunch of aesthetic snobs, maybe.
I don't know. I was like,
I know
we should be more aesthetic, right? Like,
yeah, I'm just kidding. We are kind of, but at the same time, it's really, it's an outward expression of your inner drive and your inner ability to process information, your inner ability to be integrated, and an inner ability to not be a consumer in this information war and to not be a victim. And it's also the foundation for being strong enough, having enough integrity in order to be an active decision maker and personally sovereign in the environment that we find ourselves in. And so it's not just just like go lift, dude. No, it's like the first step on a path towards personal sovereignty. What are some of the other elements that we have been working on, that you have been coaching and teaching people on? You know, noticing if you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired is a good way to understand whether or not you're susceptible to mimetic manipulation. Are there, you know, what's up the chain a little bit from there? Let's say we got all that set. What do we do after that?
Yeah, so I think the recognition that spirituality is endemic, right? So maybe not necessarily religiosity in the sense that you need to be a particular religion one way or another. It's my meditation bell. Yeah, just to remind myself, it's a decentering thing. But basically, like spirituality, right? So it's endemic. It happens. So you need to be right spiritually with yourself. But in order to get there, you need to be right physically and emotionally with yourself, right? And then once you sort of become more right with yourself physically and emotionally, then you can start getting right with yourself mentally, which, and for a lot of, men, is a very difficult process because it requires accepting that there's parts of ourselves, and there's an entire tradition called like the shadow work and all this kind of thing, but we don't need to veer into that. But basically the idea that you need to go and address all of the issues that are core to you, right? And so you'll sometimes see these mindset guys or some of the curators that we're talking about. Every once in a while, they'll talk about using psychotropic drugs like DMT, ayahuasca, all these kind of things, so that they can start to do this more difficult work. And it doesn't make sense, just like it doesn't make sense to take performance enhancing drugs or supplements or all these things. It's like if you're 400 pounds, right? If you're 80 pounds overweight, it doesn't make sense to have a huge conversation about like, what supplements you're taking from an exercise perspective. You got to like walk for 20 minutes and eat at a calorie deficit until you're closer to what your weight should be, right? Like that it's not complicated. And it's the same thing with this kind of stuff too, right? Which is, it doesn't make sense to be attacking every single area at once. You want to go through a progression. But like you said, like I was saying, the progression ends at like spirituality, and then there's some higher levels above that as well that can be useful for people.
What's interesting to me about this ideas having people thing and wanting to have your own ideas is that sometimes in the wild, let's say, people go through a natural progression where they have one set of beliefs and then something, 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 and then they have a new set of beliefs. And what is that something, something, something? It's usually trauma of some kind. It's usually a severe negative event, something that shakes your ego, your self perception, your confidence. It makes you question yourself, question everything, maybe even bring you to an existential crisis before you're willing and hungry enough to actually start building a new worldview, a new mental model of the world, one that has, I'm going to use this term fitness, but not in maybe the genetic sense, but like a mental model that has fitness for you, meaning it results in positive outcomes in your life, the positive outcomes that you desire. There's really no other standard by which to judge whether something is right or wrong or good or bad. Besides, does it bring you the things that you want and need in your life in a positive way? And that goes to, you can talk, the evolutionary guys will talk about maybe we're only evolved to just survive, not understand reality. And that's okay. I've had this conversation with Scott Adams. He's like, who cares what reality is? The only thing that matters is, does your mental model have a net positive yield? And that's a very interesting thing to consider. But I wanted to get back to this, the trauma thing. Oftentimes people need trauma in order to let go of their mental model of the world. Oftentimes we have to find ways to create an artificial trauma. We have to create an experience that tears down those walls that we've built. And I think that's why people get attracted to psychedelics and, mood altering substances at some point, which is a natural progression. You can't really just like burn your house down and have your wife leave you, as a way to just get better. But you can sort of,
some people do though,
right? You can sort of create a traumatic or just shattering sort of experience with psychedelics as well. So I'm not surprised to see that is an actual productive tool on the path towards.
Right. But just remember, most people take drugs because they want to get away from home, not because they want to learn a little bit more about home.
Yeah.
Right. Like for most, and my, myself included. And it's funny because you talk about trauma, right? And we can talk about canceling and how it seems like kind of like the Matrix, that Agent Smith of canceling is just going to happen to everyone at some point. Right. And so the question is like, when do you go through that fire and get reborn on the other side as, a bearded guy? Obviously, I'm a shorter on that journey than you are. Right. You have a couple of years on me, but that is a form of trauma that I think a lot of your listeners are probably thinking to themselves, like, how long until I'm canceled potentially, and what actions can I take today to help me with that, right? And what I would say is, as an archetype, right, the Agamemnon, let's burn our ships thing, you should lean into the fact that eventually you're going to be canceled, or eventually there's going to be one of these things that happens. In the pandemic, if you gained weight in the pandemic, there's some deep thinking that you need to do, right? Because this was an opportunity to work on yourself because we're forced to be at home. And if you didn't work on yourself, that would be worthy of reflection and understanding, right? And there's some percentage of people who are like, okay, I'm going to lose weight. I'm going to achieve my fitness goals because I can't do anything otherwise. And that should also give you some signal on the kind of person that you are. Right. And if you're worried about being canceled, just think about some of the other traumas that you've gone through and how they've changed your life. Right. Or pick up Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. Understand that when people are thrown into really dire situations, whether it's war or concentration camp or whatever, some percentage are going to reframe that situation to be positive for themselves, and some percentage are going to kill themselves. Yeah. Right. And actively or passively. And I think understanding where you are, coming into acceptance of that, and then making a plan, joining a community, following a curator, whatever, so that you can address it in the way that you want. I mean, that will be the most valuable thing for you, probably for your entire life.
Yeah. Yeah. We also talk about ritual in the liminal order, and liminality in and of itself is the space between two fixed points often induced by ritual. It is used anthropologically to describe coming of age rituals and other moments in one's life where you disconnect from the old, go through the wilderness, and then come to a new understanding and a new attachment at the end. One of the reasons why we picked the name, because of a process like that we're all going through. The country and the world and society are also going through periods of liminality right now. But what's interesting to me about this notion of ritual is it is, and like, for example, going on a vision quest for like 3 days, where you don't eat or drink in the woods by yourself. I did that when I was 14 years old, and it was a transformative, powerful experience. And I can see now how it relates to needing trauma to let go of your worldview and to adopt a new mental model of the world. See how it relates to, taking psychedelics if you're at that stage in your life and look in that stage of your progress. Or, man, as throughout history, cultures have had transformative rituals for boys becoming men because they need to let go of that whole boy mindset and find that new man mindset. And so we're always looking for ways to sort of create that process within the liminal order as well. Ritual is something that's very important to us in process as well. And then just taking what we've learned, synthesizing it, and putting it into practical application and use for people to increase their fitness, that their mental model returns to them. And so I'm just going to go on a little bit of a tangent here to describe for a second what Mike has done within the LO and why I think it's a wonderful thing. We've incubated this project for Mike, where it started off as something that he noticed, then it formulated into certain things, seminars, and then into workshops, and then into classes and courses. And now, Michael, you have put in the time and effort to create a curriculum, to train yourself. You've conducted a number of courses and things. Are you ready now for people outside the liminal order to come study sense making with you and to learn how to turn it into a real practical thing that they can use to improve their lives?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's very much an attraction thing versus me seeking you out, right? So the idea that you're going to go through the sense making course is probably not going to be easy. It's probably going to be more of an investment of time than it is of money. And these are, I think, good things that we should look for. And when you've made that decision personally that you're, ready to, it's interesting, just to go off on a slight aside, courage comes from action. Action doesn't come from courage, right? And so when you talk about rituals need to have some basis in the reality in which they're trying to create. And of course, when that basis goes away, then the ritual doesn't make sense, right? Like there's a lot of examples in religion where it doesn't make sense anymore because our technology has changed. But when we say like do something, right, and you won't know why, as a young man, like go out in the woods, have this thing, and we'll teach you why later. It really speaks to me, right? So when you think about taking the sense making class, you should ask yourself, like, am I ready to take action on my own, with a guide, with a coach, with a mentor, with a group of people? And if the answer is yes, then by all means, like, go to my website, michaelguimarin.com, and or follow me on Twitter at Mike Guimarin here. And, you can sign up for the next course. And basically, just like I told the liminal order guys, as long as there are people who are, on the wait list and it keeps growing, I will continue to figure out how we can deliver this message to them, right? Like how we can support them. And I'm not a professional coach or teacher, but
you are now, buddy.
I am now, right? And people have been saying, this is a transformative experience. This is cathartic. I'm going to use this with my kids. All the things that you would think of, this helped me find some sanity in the kind of insane world that we're in. Wow, this is actually a practice. This isn't like a book that I can read that I'll never take action on. And it's something I have to work at for the rest of my life. And to an extent, yeah, that's the case. But, like starting is, journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step. And for a lot of guys, that first step is accepting, hey, the things that I'm doing right now are not working for me. I need to make a change. Right. And then everything can happen from there.
Yeah, I took Michael's course. It was about, I think, 6 different sessions, a couple hours of each session. Yeah. I found it to be the best and most valuable time I spent that day, and I was happy to dedicate my precious time resources to it. So thank you very much, guys. If you're interested, reach out to Michael. Is it michaelguimarin.com is the website?
Yep.
Yeah, awesome. Check it out. Okay. Going to change things up a little bit. Let's talk about networks, the value
Yeah.
and power of networks. First of all, let's define what we mean when we talk about a network. You know, people have ideas, but let's just nail it down. When we talk about networks, especially in 2020, Michael, what are we talking about here?
Yeah. So most people, when they talk about networks in 2020, are talking about sort of relationships, human relationships with others. Um, and if you want to expand the definition a little bit, you can talk about entities. So, for example, the New York Times Twitter handle might be within your information network if you follow them. And that's an entity rather than an individual. But yeah, that's basically what we're talking about. So you have edges, which is the connections between nodes, and then nodes like you and me, and then the edge between us, which is our engagement, right? So you can think about it like Jack says things, I say things. There is some overlap in what we say because I might retweet what he says, he might retweet what I say. I might like something that he has, he might like something that I say. And so the more engagement between us, the stronger that edge is. The what I would say, the closer that node is in the fabric, right? And what you've seen on places like Twitter and with social networking is that, and this is just like a prelude to the rest of the conversation that we're going to have. But basically, what you've seen is the emergence of an artificial general intelligence, right? In the beginning, everybody was talking about very basic human things on Twitter, like I'm pooping, this is what I'm eating. And then over time, areas of the brain formed. So you had money Twitter, finance Twitter, black Twitter, manosphere Twitter, and now a dozen other kinds of Twitters, right? To the point, and it's very similar to like dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, the amygdala, sort of like different areas of the network are processing information that's related, that's salient to them, right? And in fact, if you want financial analysis, Twitter is way better than like watching CNBC or any of the institutions. And what coronavirus showed us is that these emergent networks, and when I say emergent, I mean people get to choose who they're connected to, right? So it's not that, I apply to go to Harvard and then I get into Harvard and therefore Harvard is my network, although that is an example. But I get to decide, I want Jack Murphy, I don't want Ben Shapiro, right? As an example. I want Alex Jones, except that he got partitioned. But anyway, it doesn't matter. They emerge because people get to form them, and then they're dynamic. So you might be following someone for a long time. You might get a lot of value out of them. You might outgrow them, right? And certainly that happens as well. As we grow as humans, right? Like there's parts of our brain that we don't use as much anymore because those memories are no longer salient and relevant to us. And like that is a very interesting phenomena to study because it's very clear that from a sense-making perspective, because there's so much information in the world, no one person anymore has the ability to understand what's happening. And so we have to understand what's happening as part of a group. And so forming that network, becoming part of that tribe, becomes basically a life and death experience if you want to live in the world. And there's a lot of things that are falling out from that because basically as soon as the value of a sense-making entity shifts, all of the fundamentals also shift, right? So the game theory, the economic theory pushed us towards institutions, right? But now that there's a structure, this emergent networking thing that can think better and faster than institutions, a lot of the things that held institutions together are going to get ripped apart, right? Like Twitter put Donald Trump in the White House, which is crazy. And then Twitter was faster on coronavirus the first time. And then the second time, which was, hey, actually, we've gotten more information. There's more nuance to this than we've been told. So it's really interesting. Like people are upset at the government, not because they were wrong about coronavirus, but because they were slow. Right? Like it's like amazing. They went through their process, which is they, take a lot of information, they make a committee, they form some whatever. And by the time that they'd done all that, we'd all been like, hello, this is a thing for like weeks. And because there are well-known ways to disrupt that process, near peer states were able to sort of change the reality of it. And what's interesting is now you have the WHO saying like, hey, you shouldn't have lockdowns. And, I'm here in California and we have lockdowns.
It's amazing what happened with Corona as such a powerful example of emergent networks, of sense making as an apparatus, as a network, as Twitter as a sense making tool. Sort of the real final establishment of Twitter and social media as an exocortex, something that is outside of us but helps us become become fitter and more able to survive in a practical way, in a positive way in the world. So this is really a seminal year. Like, this is a massive change. What happened with Corona, and John Robb points this out quite a bit, is that the network decided the network decided for shutdowns. The network decided that they were willing to stay inside at first, right? Back in March, the network decided that we were ready for that. And it was interesting to see how far ahead of the government the networks were in just understanding and discovering and coming up with options and possibilities and whatever else, which is just an excellent testament to the power and the speed of our new exocortex, and how credentialism is dead, and
Totally.
how the experts are dead. And in fact, if you get held out as an expert, at least from my world and my perspective, now it just means you're probably not on the ball, right? If you've spent enough time to become an expert and get credentialed and have everyone be like, "Oh, you're an expert." No, man, the fucking network is the expert, and the network moves much more quickly, much more powerfully, much more profoundly than ever before. And we're going to see more of that in the future. And one little caveat on what you said about Twitter getting Trump elected. Yeah, in lay terms. But the reality is that Twitter was a tool that the emergent network, the political network that evolved, used to launch Trump into office. And we don't have to argue about that, but that was just
No, I think it's a good point, which is a general point, which is that anytime that we introduce a new technology that seems to have new behaviors, it's just not, right? It's just like, it contains all of the previous technologies, right? Like, when agriculture came out as a technology, it didn't eliminate hunter-gathering, it included it, right? When we became an industrial society, we didn't stop farming. We still were subject to agricultural concerns. As we become an information society, we're still subject to industrial society politics, economics, same with agriculture, same with hunter and gathering. It's just that we're adding on this information layer that causes us to reinterpret everything else, right? And it's the same with, Donald Trump is a very classic populist type movement. You could say that happened, with Teddy Roosevelt or at that era of time around 1900 in the U.S. as well. And that, Trump was more effective because there was an avenue for that expression of populist discontent, which was Twitter. Whereas maybe there was a populist of similar means 40 years ago, but the institutions were able to suppress support for that, right?
Yeah. Interesting historical comparisons, difficult to make given the new technology environment that we live in. Fascinating stuff for sure. Now let's talk about what becomes valuable in the sense of a network. We talked about curation, right? So if you have a network of curators, that's something valuable. We've talked about creating small personal private networks that function as sense-making apparatus and intelligence tools and things like that. What's the next level from here? Let's say you've done a good job to curate your Twitter follows to have them be excellent curators that have returned value and fitness to you. Maybe you've even started or joined a network, a small network, to get value out of that. What's coming after that? I feel like we're sort of on the cutting edge at this point, but maybe there's a deeper edge for us to aim towards, or maybe we're already there. What's coming next?
Yeah. So in a digitized economy, the only thing that becomes valuable are attention and effort, and then vectors that are created as a result of those two things being multiplied together in a particular direction. Right. So when you think about creating your network, if you think about it as a consumer, it's only going to have so much value to you. If you think about how can I produce for the network that I'm in and use that as a way to create gravity for myself and for the ideas that I believe in that are resonant to me. And oh, by the way, like, when you meet someone who's like really like a positive person, they just have this incredible energy that they're mission aligned and you want to be with them. And then that's an agglomerating force. And actually that's how you create consensus in a networked environment, right? So like right now we create consensus through institutional like exercise of power, and that doesn't work, which is why we're seeing decoherence across the entire information space, the kind of cancel culture. John Robb talks a lot about, this tribalism, and the only thing we can do is destroy. Well, the counteraction of that is this idea that you come into resonance with your mission, you surround yourselves voluntarily with people who are also in resonance with your mission, and then you do everything that you can to amplify that, which is why it's so important to curate your network to be something that you want it to be reflective of, and not just look at it as a consumption thing. And then it turns out that as you become a more valuable network to those, or a node to those that are adjacent to you, they'll be more willing to help you in situations where you need help, whether it's, you need a GoFundMe for your medicine, or you're launching a new book, or you want to start a new network, right? So think about how you can go from being a consumer to being a producer if you're trying to look for the next step, right? Like, and then of course that changes the game theory as well, because there's a lot of people who are consumers who are pseudonymous or who are anonymous, right? Who've done a really good job curating a network, and now all of a sudden they want to add value to it. Well, there's a limit to how much you can add as a pseudonym, because people don't know who you are. They don't trust you potentially, right? And you could say, like, you can actually build up quite a bit of trust, but then like if you get revealed, then all of a sudden it can go away for whatever reason. And so it's just better to be authentic from the first place. So what you're going to see is people who want to be successful in the emergent networks that are happening, they'll be more authentic to who they are, right? And they'll produce a lot. They'll really be resonant for what they have, and that will cause a lot of value to accrue to them, because their engagement is high, so they have a lot of attention, and then the effort that they have is directed at a particular thing. So.
It's interesting that deliberate and proactive network creation and curation are life skills now. We need to teach our kids. How do you curate your network? How do you build networks? How do you control your information diet? How do you control what's going in and out of you? These are all very important skills that nobody is teaching anybody, because very few people have identified this as even a thing, much less an issue, much less something that you need to be proactive about, much less established best practices on how to do. And that's sort of where we are right now in liminal order.
Yeah. That's when I talk about we're at the 1% phase. Eventually, all of those things that we're dependent on, like institutions and all these things, will have all these things built in. And so if you're a guy who wants to take action and become very wealthy, figuring out how to take what we're talking about and make it more palatable to the mainstream is going to be hugely valuable in the future, because there are so many people who are lost and confused who aren't going to be able to do all of this hard work on their own. And so they're going to need help, right? And because they're going to need help, there's going to be an opportunity to create these new institutions and these new things. And of course, they're not going to look the same as the institutions of the past, but they'll rhyme, right? History rhymes. So.
Yeah. We've talked about curation, creation. Is there another C word when it comes to networks? Talk to me about network calibration.
Yeah, calibration is an interesting topic in that there's a couple of things. So you see individuals calibrating their own networks. And this is, I love talking about this guy because he's just amazing at Twitter, which is Mike Smirnovich. He blocks people all the time. And this is a great example of calibrating his network, because when you block someone, you basically remove them from the conversation so that you don't have to deal with them anymore, and you curate your own information network, but you also help all of your followers, right? And so now all your followers aren't, shitted up by that terrible person, potentially. And you'll also see people like Jack, I've seen you do this before, where they'll sort of like shake the tree, if you will, by saying negative things or things that are like kind of extreme, just to, like,
or counter narrative to your own tribe.
Yeah, exactly. So here's the thing, right? Institutions are great in that they're slow, which means that they have an incredible power, right? It's like a battleship. And networks are great because they're really nimble, but you trade off an increase in the amount of noise in your signal to noise ratio. Like, you get a huge amount of noise, which means that you have to be more comfortable with uncertainty. And the global game theory will go from absolute certainty, as exemplified by like the Pulitzer Prize, to like everyone has to be comfortable with a huge amount of uncertainty that you just have to. You don't have a choice. And mostly everyone who's alive today won't make that choice. They'll have to die and be replaced by the next generation before that shift happens. Right. And that's a whole other topic of like, how do we deal with that? But like when you are calibrating your network, you can do it individually by making these extreme statements. And so then people at the frontiers, they partition away. And there's an interesting conversation to be had about Twitter partitioning networks as a way to calibrate as well, right? So, and this sort of maybe gets into the metaphysical, but so
do it.
This is, yeah, right. Twitter noticed that there's speech and other, so like everybody, you go like watch Ex Machina, you go watch like devs, you go watch all this Silicon Valley technology stuff, you go look at the religion of the singularitarians, right? And there's like a lot of prominent people that super believe in that, potentially even me. And everybody thought that like Google was going to be an artificial general intelligence, because you're going to take every single purchase intent thing that somebody typed in, and you would be able to create a model of humanity. And then everybody thought that like Facebook was going to be an artificial general intelligence, right? And so like when you look at like the science fiction that comes off of these two companies and the two modes of thinking that come about them, that's what you thought. And nobody, especially not Jack Dorsey, ever imagined that Twitter would start to look like an AGI, right? And like we have this like vision of an AGI. It's like it's a robot. It's like the Matrix. It's like Terminator. It's not this like centaured emergent network thing. And yet that is like literally what's happening, right? And it's very new. So there are still some people who are better than the group in some areas, but not many, right? And that number of areas goes down consistently. And so basically, like imagine you're at the head of this AGI, and you're like, oh my God, like this is not reflecting the beliefs that we want about society. Like it's taking us in a direction we don't want to go. Like we have to figure out a way to control this thing, right? And like humanity can't control our technology, right? And our technology is neither good nor bad. It just force multiplies whatever is there, right? So like Twitter at the totality scale is just humanity, right? And it's like, and so you have these people who are in control, and they're like, okay, manosphere Twitter or whatever it is, conservative Twitter, I think is the easy one to look at. It's getting too powerful, right? These ideas, this fake news is traveling through. So we're going to do like everything we can to undermine it, right? So they tried hard censorship, which is like blocking people. And like, there's only so much of that you can do without, negatively impacting your economic value, right? So you want people to stay on Twitter, and you don't want to like necessarily like ban a lot more people than say Alex Jones. And so what they started to do was unfollow people at the frontier of a particular emergent network cluster, right? So what will happen is you'll be like a small Twitter user and you'll follow a bunch of people. And then, one day you'll have been like unfollowed from them, and you'll be like, why did that happen? I didn't unfollow them. And it's an example of like, there's, if you think about it as a graph and you try to imagine the different areas of Twitter, and you want to stop a mimetic wave from propagating from one side of Twitter to another, the best way to do that is to remove edges at the intersection of those two graphs, right? And you can't remove all of them because people notice and then recreate them, but you can like certainly slow them down, right? And then you can screw up the number of likes, and you can screw up the retweet function, and then you can put like notices like this is fake, right? All these things are like to slow the mimetic propagation of information through the network. And so like, this is an example of calibration. And what's amazing about it is like, there's this very fine line where you over calibrate the network and the Tower of Babel falls. And now all of a sudden you have a gazillion federated networks that all create on affinity lines, right? So you have like Rofkin and Parler and the liminal order and blah, blah, blah. And like, they're all never going to be as valuable as like a total war Twitter to everybody. But they're all going to be like specifically much more valuable for the people that are in them, right? And there's 100 or so, Signal communities, WhatsApp groups, Slack channels that are emerging across all kinds of affinities, right? So there's just a tremendous amount of energy to recreating these networks, both public and private. And you have VC investments like House Party, and it goes on and on and on and on. And in every single instance, you have the ability to calibrate at a network level. So to act like a Twitter, right? So in the liminal order, you might say people who are not acting in accordance with our values are going to get ejected, right? So this is an example of censorship or banning them. And it's the same idea of calibration. And the network itself is going to go through stages as it grows and as it gets more intelligent, right? So as the even if you have the same number of nodes, as the edges get stronger because people have more in-person interactions or whatever, there's going to be some growth that happens. And we're so early in this network calibration. You could look at like all of the early Usenet communities, the BBSs, all of that sort of the dark nets as a way to see it. And you can like look at like the way that Reddit and Stack Overflow and Y Combinator look at editing their networks, calibrating them as well. But again, those are all sort of still directed in a primary mechanism. Whereas the networks that we're seeing now, it's like you're transferring images, you're transferring video, you're transferring text, you're having real life conversations, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's so much more leveraged, if you will, than some of those previous networks. And so there's an entire emerging understanding of that stuff. Hopefully that was interesting.
Yeah, it's great, man. It's great. I mean, this is the next step in terms of you have to have a network. You're only as powerful as your network. It used to be, the phrase was, son, it's not what you know, it's who you know. Well, that is still true.
Totally.
And it's just amplified times a million billion in this networked environment that we live in. And so we have to start teaching people these things, and we have to become aware of these life cycles, and we have to become aware of how we're going to fine tune these things to better serve us in the future. And just as a side note, well, not a side note, as a story from my personal life, and in the creation of the liminal order and the way that that's working, that is definitely network creation. And then there's curation. And now we're on to calibration. We've established common values. If you're not in line with the values, you're out. We've established communication norms and standards. If you're not in line with those, you're out. And now we've been creating new subnetworks within the liminal order, right? Based on like Dunbar's numbers and the number of relationships you can manage. So we figured out that like 150 guys in a group is about the right number. We're now on our third. We just closed it, our third group of 150. And each time we create these new groups, it's like a new Big Bang all over again. It's like a whole new universe. And then we can calibrate the way the Big Bang even works in this network creation and how they're going to interact with the larger sort of overall overarching network that we've established. And so it's a very fascinating notion to me, network calibration. I do it in my podcast network, right? I do it within my personal network. I do it within my curated network on Twitter. And now I'm also doing it within the liminal order as a way to just get it right and to tweak it and to get the right outcomes. And each time we have a new cohort and a new group, it's like the Big Bang all over again. It's a crazy experiment, and it's not to say these cohorts are cut off from the network. That's absolutely not true. They just cross-sect the network in different ways. So we have entry cohorts, and then you have local cohorts that cross-sect the network. And then you have interest and professional guilds sort of arising within the liminal order. We've got 25 lawyers. We've got 25 professors. We've got 50, tech guys, full stack, every aspect of tech. We've got 50, former LEO or current or active military guys. And then those are networks that cross-sect each other too. And we calibrate each one of those through guides and norms and values, et cetera, to get the desired result. And in our case, the desired result is only one thing: make men happier, healthier, and wealthier. Right? That's the goal. And so everything that we do to calibrate to come to that outcome. Now, if you're Twitter, you have a different goal. We don't even know what the hell Twitter's goal is. You would think that Twitter's goal is, number one, exclusively return value to shareholders, but I don't think that's actually the case.
No.
We don't even know what their goal is. So their calibration to us seems incongruent. It seems dumb. It seems sloppy because we don't really even know what they're going for. Maybe we can infer based on their actions what they're going for, right? Like, calibration is a confusing thing. If you're not hip to what the goal is, what do you think their goals are? And what are your comments on this, the smaller networks within the LO as well?
Yeah, so I would say, there's a couple of things that are embedded there. Number one is, it's interesting that you talk about the Big Bang and the evolution of the networks, the sub networks, and how you're calibrating them. One of the great models, unfortunately, would be like ISIS, right? Or Antifa, or any sort of fourth generation warfare community that is completely decentralized, auto-replicating, and how they're all working, right? And they all look the same functionally from a metadata standpoint. Like, obviously the specifics are different, but like, so that's an interesting concept. On the other side is this idea that, what is Twitter? I don't think that when it was created, there was an intention that it would be the way that it was today. Right. And so I think and I think there might be confusion at the company itself just given the total information environment that we're in, the total war, as to what it is that they're doing or where it is that they're going, which is why it seems like they don't progress very quickly. A lot of people project their understanding of the way things are onto the way things are emerging, and that can be quite false, right? So they talk about something like the digital town square, and the idea that sort of that is desirable is an open question, right? Like taking Facebook as an example, Mark Zuckerberg is colorblind, and because he's colorblind, the color schema at Facebook is blue, which means that 2 billion people interact with the technology that's in a particular way because one guy in Palo Alto is colorblind. And when you think about like the idea that Mark Zuckerberg is going to create a culture that, helps unite every single person in humanity, I mean, it's just like an absurdly difficult thing to do. And you almost feel bad for the guy because how could you possibly reconcile all of the different, emergent behaviors and cultures and all of humanity into a single system that could work, right? And so then, of course, you're in this sort of total war where now you're really big, and the U.S. government and the Russian government and the Chinese government all want to regulate you in a different way. And maybe they don't physically allow your network in their space, but they're certainly acting inside of it. And then how do you do that, right? And then how is it that we have the kinetic environment? So like the Cold War was fought kinetically, but how is a Cold War between the near peer superpowers being fought digitally on Facebook, right? I mean, it's just like, this is like really hard, and there's not enough empathy, to your point, about like, first of all, this problem. And then the second question that comes up is like, should we even allow this kind of thing to happen, right? And will there become a time where Facebook is a commoditized product as opposed to sort of a corporate product? Kind of like how the implementation phase of the telephone network was, a single company with AT&T, and then we broke them up, and now all of a sudden there's a lot of regional telecoms. Now that's maybe a bad example, but there are other examples that are similar to that, where technology goes through this life cycle of being really innovative, then everyone gets it, and now it's totally commoditized. I don't know. So it's
possible that'll happen with social media for sure, especially the biggest ones.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. What I think will happen is you'll get the decentralized web. It will actually work. And there'll be some kind of balkanization that occurs across all affinity and identity categories, right? And tribal affiliation will be very ephemeral, right? So you'll join and leave tribes pretty quickly. You might have like a primary tribe that you're a part of, but you'll want to be careful that your tribe doesn't get wiped out by, it's kind of like a game of Risk where suddenly people are making allies really quickly. And so what you'll see is a lot of behavior where you have the narrative that you're pushing and then the counter narrative, and like you'll be 50.0001% on the narrative that you want to push, and then the other way for the other one. So you can sort of ride out two different networks at the same time. And then only at a moment of like actual action and collective action do you like fully lean into one side or the other, right? So you'll start to see this happen more and more, which is this idea that like you don't know who an enemy combatant is, and anyone could be a civilian or a combatant at any time. I think that that's part of that uncertainty, and it will become difficult. And so the idea of calibration in creating these networks with those primitives it's just like it's so new, that we're going to spend a lot of time reading all of our literature looking for ways to do it, and it'll be really hard. And you'll get all this esoteric stuff, and then some random 100 IQ person will try something, and that will be super effective, and humanity will sort of recenter.
Well, before humanity recenters, there's got to be options for guys like you and me to find a way to make better sense of the world, to find a team and a network that is moving in the same direction, like a school of fish, rather than somebody like a shepherd with a flock. That's the way that I like to see the liminal order, more of like a school of fish rather than me at the top as a hierarchical leader here. We're trying to create something that's decentralized, and a great way to form a decentralized network is based on values or plausible promises or just visions for the future. And if we can all keep, and we have those, and we can clearly define them, which is why we spend so much time clearly defining the values of liminal order so that people as the fish in the school of fish can then just sort of act in unison, but really independently, but all based on the values. So that's why we spend a lot of time pushing that out and talking about it and consistently hammering those points home, because that's going to be the anchor. That's going to be the anchor when big forces come through and tidal waves and tsunamis and network disruptions and whatever. A network built around values, which are timeless and everlasting and inside of all of us, is a pretty solid piece of bedrock to build upon. And it's really fun to be right on the absolute tip of the spear of all this stuff. Not only is the content that we're discussing, the future, the way we're doing it, the meta systems that we're involved in, the infrastructure that we've created, and just the whole participatory experience is one of a kind. There's nothing else like it out there. If you're interested, guys, come check it out. liminal-order.com, where guys like Mike are and where I am, and we're all working towards solving some of these problems together. Yes, sir. What do you got to say?
I want to make one point on this. If you're on the fence about joining one of these communities, right? Like obviously Jack and I are pretty passionate about the values from the liminal order. And so we, want to, auto replicate them. But if you think back to what we talked about at the earliest side about the digitization of information, making it free to distribute, there's sort of 4 categories that information comes in, sort of propositional, which would be E equals MC squared, or like what you might think of as a traditional fact. Procedural, which is sort of the recipe on how to do something. Perspectival, which is you watch me build a birdhouse with a hammer and nails and wood, and then you can do it. And then participatory. So if you believe that the future is going to be more of these 4th generation warfare communities, more of these emergent, decentralized, values-based tribes that are forming and unforming, because participatory information is the only one that we can't digitize, it's the only one that's going to be valuable. And therefore, you should actually join one of these communities simply to observe what works and what doesn't work. So that way, the next time when you find one that may be more resonant or maybe more valuable to you, you'll actually have a basis of comparison. If you sit on the sidelines and wait, then you're losing out on all of the benefits of learning about what these communities look like as they're growing. And so I would highly recommend thinking about participating in some way, shape, or form, both in the network that you're curating on Twitter or other places, but also in these sort of communities that are emerging and that you're a part of.
Definitely. Participatory information, the participatory experience, community as service. That's a new one that I've seen, CAAS, right? Community as service. And I found that this entire process and the entire acted experience that we're all having is what creates the product, right? It's the actions that we do, the participation. It's not so much the information. You can get the information out there. You can find research on these subjects. You can go out there and do your own curation, but there's no way to replicate the participatory experience of what's happening inside when you've got 500 guys committed to figuring out how to make the world work for themselves and for the people that they believe in, or the people that they love and care for. So it's been a fascinating experience. Michael, I've really enjoyed getting to know you and watching you grow and watching your products grow and just going through this incubation process. Just there's one thing that we do in the LO, guys. We incubate new ideas, and we've incubated a new idea here with Mike. We've refined it a couple of times, gone through alpha and beta, and now Michael's ready to take this out to the world. So go to michaelguimarin.com and sign up for his email list and get some information about how to become an intentional understander, how to become a sense maker, how to increase levels of your personal sovereignty so that you can embody your values. So you can even know what your values are in the first place and then be able to embody them and live them out in the world. And if you can then live them out, then after that, you can manifest more of them in the world around you, which is what our goal is for sure. Michael Guimarin, thank you so much, my friend. This has been a fascinating conversation. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Follow Mike on Twitter, Mike at Mike Guimarin on Twitter, Michael Guimarin on the website. Mike, any parting words for the people who are listening today? We've had a lot of people here in the audience. It's been awesome.
Yeah, I would just say thank you to everyone for coming today. We're early innings in this, and it's going to be really fascinating to see how it evolves. And just like there was that period with the RIAA, back 20 years ago, and it seemed pretty dark for the music industry. We will come through this. No need to black pill. No need to think there's not going to be a music industry in the future. There will be. It'll come back stronger. And whether for you that is the media environment or politics or whatever it is, just know that if humanity was going to destroy itself, it would have happened 400 generations ago. So we're doing fine. It's just a little chaotic now, and maybe for the next 30 to 50 years.
Comforting. 30 to 50 years. We are in a period of liminality, and it is important to bring order to liminality, and it's important to do it with a band of brothers, like an order of men. The liminal order, the name has a purpose behind it for sure. Come down, check it out, liminal-order.com. Follow me on Twitter at jackmurphylive. Hit subscribe on whatever podcast app you're listening to this on. Please do. YouTube folks, hit subscribe. Smash the like button, as my buddy Tim Pool says all the time. Funny, just there's a comment here that says, Tim Pool and Jack Murphy are CIA assets designed to ease tensions on the right wing. Get out of here. I'm a CIA
it's a counterintelligence op. I love it.
Yes, I work for the CIA now. Awesome.
No,
Can
Mossad. We know it's Mossad for you,
Mossad.
Jack.
Right. Right. Exactly right. All right, guys. Thanks everybody for joining us. Again, hit subscribe. Follow Mike Guimarin. Thank you. Come down, join the Liminal Order. Appreciate it. Thanks for all the comments. You guys have been great. See you soon on Jack Murphy Live. Bye-bye.